Hi, I'm Belinda Carley, the Director of the Institute of Personal Care Science, and every day I'd get at least 2 questions about preservatives in formulations, particularly when someone's starting out and they don't quite understand, can they swap out certain preservatives for others? So while I have other videos on preservatives and even blogs explaining the use of preservatives in personal care products, I thought I'd summarise in a little video for you why you can't necessarily just swap out one preservative for another. The first thing you need to consider is the input of the preservative. Now, a lot of people think that preservatives all get used at 1%. This isn't correct. For some preservatives, 1% is a really good input. But for some other preservatives, 1% may be far too little and 1% may be far too much. Preservatives, even when they're naturally sourced or synthetically produced but chemically identical to those that occur in nature, they can still be very irritating for consumers. So using the wrong amount may mean your product is not effectively preserved, or may mean it may cause irritation issues for consumers. There's also some preservatives that are not meant to be used in leave-on products. Some preservatives are intended for use in wash-off products only, so they have a short contact time. Please make sure you check the correct input to use in your formulation, because too little or too much is not a good thing, and 1% is not necessarily the right input for many preservatives. You also need to make sure that if you're swapping out a preservative, that you're making sure you have broad spectrum coverage. A lot of blends these days do provide good broad spectrum coverage, but if you start swapping out some of these blended materials for single preservatives, you may find that your product is not adequately preserved against the many types of microorganisms that product may come into contact with over its shelf life or throughout consumer use. So make sure that if you are changing your preservative, you're using the right input and it's broad spectrum in its function. And that means protection against bacteria, yeast, and mold. Another thing that's really important with your preservatives is the pH range over which they are effective. This one you can usually get from your supplier information, but you need to also be careful because the pH of your product will move over time. The pH of a product will never remain constant. It will change. So you need to make sure that the preservative you're using is effective at the pH of the product throughout its entire shelf life, which is why stability testing is a really important part of any product development process. But when you're selecting your preservatives, you need to make sure that the preservatives you're using will be effective over the standard pH drift of your formula throughout its shelf life. And there's a lot of naturally derived or nature identical preservatives that get used nowadays at too low an input or the wrong pH. A lot of those materials actually require quite an acidic pH environment to be effective, which means if your formula is more around the neutral range, your product may as well not have a preservative at all. So check the pH range that your preservative needs and make sure that your formula is finalized at a pH that will allow for pH drift over time to ensure that preservative is still going to be effective right through to the end of its shelf life. Another thing to consider when you're swapping out your preservative is the regulations. So I've talked previously about the right input to make sure that your preservative is effective, but a lot of preservatives, even nature identical and naturally derived preservatives, all have limits that are set by regulators, and these can vary around the world. Now, these limits are set to help ensure safe use by consumers, but you need to make sure that wherever you're selling your product, that the amount of preservative used is within those regulatory limits. So you can't just swap out another preservative in another region or even your own region without checking the regulations carefully. And just because a preservative is nature identical or naturally derived doesn't mean that it doesn't have a regulation. A lot of naturally derived and nature identical preservatives also have strict regulatory limits to ensure safe use in finished products for your consumers. Being natural may be another thing you need to consider when swapping out your preservative. Preservatives, although marketed as being naturally derived, may not actually be naturally derived. You'll need to check this carefully. There are some preservatives like sodium benzoate, benzoic acid, benzoyl alcohol, sorbic acid, and potassium sorbate that get marketed as being natural when they are in fact commercially produced synthetically for use in cosmetics. This means that chemically they are identical to what occurs in nature, but that actual preservative that gets used in your cosmetic formula is synthetically produced. So it shouldn't be marketed as an all-natural product or all-natural preservative if it's one of the ones I've mentioned in particular, because these are synthetic materials used in cosmetic formulas. Although they are of course identical to what occurs in nature, we are not using a natural form in the formulas simply because we can't get the commercial quantities we need for use in cosmetic formulas. So just be careful. How natural is that preservative that you are using? Is it as natural as you really think it is? Check it carefully before making the claims about your product or swapping out your current preservative, because you may find you're swapping out a perfectly good preservative for another that is also synthetically produced. Another thing to consider when you're swapping out your preservatives is they can have an impact on the viscosity of your final formula. They can definitely have an impact on the stability of your final formula. They can impact the final pH of your formula, and they may also have solubility issues in your final formula. So it's not a matter of taking one out and putting another one in at the same amount. You need to check the input. You need to check the pH at which they're most effective. You need to make sure that they're broad spectrum in their activity. You need to check their naturalness if that's part of your marketing claims, and you need to check what sort of impact they're going to have on your final formula. Will they change the form, the appearance, or the viscosity of that final product such that it will impact either the use of the product, the way it flows from the packaging, or your consumer's experience? Also think about long-term stability. When you say preservatives to a lot of people, the first thing they think of is protection against microbial contamination. And that's definitely what they get used for. But just remember, there's no good picking a great preservative that works in theory if it makes your product too runny or impacts your formula in another way such that it doesn't achieve a good shelf life. It may also impact the aroma of your finished product or cause product separation. So make sure you check carefully about that input, pH compatibility, broad spectrum, functionality, and of course make a sample and run at least short-term accelerated stability tests on that product to make sure it doesn't impact your formula in a negative way. So as you can see, you can't just swap out one preservative for another. There's a lot to consider. I have some videos about selecting preservatives. I've got a live Q&A replay you can watch where I run through some other preservative selection criteria and answer questions from the audience. And we have some blogs on this topic as well. We do of course have professional training if you want to learn how to select your preservatives more confidently. It's not a simple matter of swapping one for another, and yet it's such an important and critical decision you need to make when formulating your cosmetic products. I hope this video has helped you understand some of the issues and why you can't just swap out preservatives easily. Please give the video a thumbs up. Please leave any questions or comments below, and make sure you subscribe to receive notifications about all our videos. Happy formulating!